at least, somewhere after 70, but where would you put it?
It was known to people who were writing in about the year 150. So most likely it was, we don't know for sure.
Right.
Early second century, between 90 and say 120 or 30, we just don't know for sure. So some people want to say it's very late, but late tradition can still preserve oral tradition in the ancient world.
That's true.
It doesn't mean anything about how authentic it is. It's just that you're not supposed to tell secret teaching, and that was supposed to be Jesus' secret teaching, which every rabbi has.
Could you tell me if, I got a quite echo. There we go. The Gospel of John and Paul, is there this Gnostic teaching there? I mean, obviously, I am the resurrection. I am the life. Like that's a pretty bold statement to make. Can you tell us any Gnostic ideas? And I use the term Gnostic. I know there's this debate of, was there really a Gnostic sect? Well, there were various sects with strange teachings that sound very Gnosis-like. But do you find Gnosticism inside of the New Testament canon? And then I'd like to probe another interesting question your way.
Many people have. The word Gnostic becomes a dirty word. It's derogatory. It just means these are the bad Gospels. Don't read those. Right. I was told yesterday by a former evangelical friend that my books were always, he was always told they were dangerous because they can change your point of view. and these texts, Gnosis means insight, and it means insight about who you are, not so much who Jesus is. But if you know who you are, according to the Gospel of Thomas, you can find your way back to God because you have a secret link that you can follow inside yourself. And that's why you may not need a church. That's why you may not need a priest, a bishop, doctrines, Bible even. This is before there's a church, and before there's a New Testament, and before there's a Bible, the kind we have, and before there are Christian doctrines about the nature of Jesus. This was a mystical teaching that they say Jesus taught, and Jews have taught it for thousands of years. He was, of course, a Jewish teacher. If you read the New Testament in Greek, they're saying rabbi, where we read teacher.
So this makes me want to ask about the Gospel of Thomas. When the disciples ask him, and this is an interesting verse, when will be the repose of the dead, the resurrection? And he says, look around. It's already happened. And they don't see anything happen. You know, it's like, well, what do you mean it's already happened? The reason I ask is there is a group of people who want to suggest that the resurrection, like they, of course, can't, the whole canon is speaking, they're fundamentalists in their thinking. So everything connects and all the doctrines are all teaching the same thing. They believe the end happened in 70 AD.
Oh.
And so they're called full preterist. But this Gnostic idea, I told him, I was like, why don't you actually read the Gospel of Thomas to support your claim? Well, the reason is it goes outside of what they consider canon. But it's like in this book, he tells you the resurrection already happened. And I kind of wanted your thoughts on this. But do you think the argument of cognitive dissonance, if you will, might be what's happened within the Gospels? They anticipate an end to happen. It's supposed to end. They're expecting a world actual changing in this world change.
Yeah.
And it took a spin, and kind of like what we saw with the Millerite movement in the 1800s. The end is going to happen. And when it didn't happen, half the group said it did. It was spiritual though. And the other half said, yeah. And the other half was like, well, we got the date wrong because nothing really happened. Do you think that's what happened with Christianity within the New Testament? And of course, the reason that the church continued, it never really ended. What was expected never happened. Do you think that's why they maybe spiritualized stuff in John, realized eschatology as they call it?
Yes, I think that's a very good possibility. And it may be also why others say, well, what's resurrection? It doesn't mean the body gets out of the grave. It's a metaphor for spiritual awakening. what the Buddhists call awakening. When you become aware of spiritual reality, then you come out of being basically dead to the spiritual world. You come alive spiritually. So they said that's what it means. And you can consider yourself already raised from the dead. But Orthodox Christians said, no, it has to mean that the body was in the grave and then it's out. But that becomes a doctrine of the Orthodox Church. The resurrection of the dead means the resurrection of the body.
I wonder if they're right about it, only because they're pulling from Genesis, Adam, Paul, and he's saying, look, the first Adam all died, second Adam all will be made alive. And whether you make a universalist claim here or whatever, the point is like, does Paul think that actual physical death's what entered the world through Adam? And does he mean actual resurrection? And what does he mean? I mean, this is interpretation, you know?
Well, we don't know. But if you look at, for example, at the 4th chapter of Mark, where Jesus says, he's teaching the disciples, I'm only telling you the mystery of the kingdom of God. And then he doesn't tell them. The Gospel of Thomas says, well, I'm going to tell you what he really said. Because he only speaks in parables in Mark for the most part. When you look at Paul, 1 Corinthians 2:6, he says, look, we too, we speak wisdom among the initiates. We speak divine wisdom, which is hidden before the universe for your glory. When the archons crucified Jesus, they didn't know what they were doing. And as you said, the archons there are not simply the spiritual powers. They are the spiritual powers energizing the rulers of the world, who are Romans, to do it. But Paul says, we have wisdom. I'm not going to tell you what it is, because you people are babies in Christ. You're not ready for it. I can't do it. I can't tell you things. You don't understand anything. You're just babies. 1 Corinthians 1 and 2. But people who understand the way I was taught, he says, were taught by the Spirit in a mystical way. Spirit speaking to spirit. And we understand the deep things of God. You don't. So you just got the elementary version, and I've got the deep version, but I'm not going to tell you what it is because I can't write it down. It's really prohibited to write down mystical teachings.
This is actually like his own vision where he says, I met a man once. He's talking about himself, and he's saying things I cannot legally even mention.
Yeah, I can't tell you what I saw up there. I was lifted up into heaven.
Right.
But I can't talk about that.
Do you think that this is a mystery? I guess I'm trying to pin Paul down. Like, who is this guy?
Good luck with that.
I know. Like, do you think he claims to be a Pharisee, but what kind of version of a person is this? You see?
We have very little understanding of Jewish groups in the ancient world. You know, a lot of that was destroyed partly because the rabbis, like the Christian church later, wanted everything to come from them. And they destroyed a lot of sources. We found them at the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are many apocryphal writings, which means writings outside of the Hebrew Bible, mystical writings, talk about, ecstatic experiences, talk about mysteries. And I think sometimes that the secret Gospels of Jesus come from that mystical Jewish tradition, which is thousands of years old, and which Christians said, well, that stuff is heresy. He would never have said that.
Right.
I don't know. He might have. I can't say he did because we don't know. But I think it's quite likely that if Jesus taught as other rabbis in the first century did, he would have taught secretly to people he felt were on a deeper level.
Interesting. Okay, back to Satan, and then we'll start to wrap things up because I love this, by the way. You can tell that you have so much insight from reading the material and just immersing yourself with it that, and you're scholarly about it. You don't say this is you're very balanced in your approach on, I'm not sure, or I know, or it's so Satan.
There's a lot we don't know. There's a lot we don't know. That's really true.
The Jews get vilified. we know this in the 2nd century. Early church fathers are literally vilifying them and saying, "You Christ killers."
Yeah.
But we see a turn take place here where now Christians are using the term Satan against one another.
Yes.
And do we see that in the New Testament? We see it used against the Jews, but is there hints of it in the New Testament with other gospels? Is Paul talking to Jews when he's talking about let them be accursed, or
I don't think so. He's talking about people who do things that he thinks are despicable, like somebody living with his father's wife, or something like that, some kind of sexual.
or circumcision on a Gentile, right? Like that.
That's a question. I don't know about that. That's the
Interesting.
book of Acts.
Oh,
But
no. Galatians. When he was saying
okay.
another
Yes.
gospel, and I figured it might have been anyway. Sorry.
When he says, let them, if somebody teaches another gospel than the gospel I teach, let them be accursed. Who do you think he's talking about?
For me, I would say I think it's the circumcisers. I think these people. But then again, he goes on to talk about castrate yourself. Then if you're going to circumcise,
he's talking about Peter and James, most likely.
Okay,
Because
this is powerful.
Peter and James criticize him. And they say he didn't know Jesus at all. He never knew Jesus. Peter was Jesus's right-hand man, and James was his brother. And this Paul comes and says, well, I have a gospel to go to the Gentiles, and Jesus appeared to me up in the sky. And, Jesus had been dead by the time Paul said he saw him. And so they suspected that what he said wasn't true. And I think he's speaking about some people. You may think they're angels from heaven, but you know what? They're really not. I would curse them. He's very angry at Peter and James. That's the way I've understood that passage. Now, there are different ways to read it, I'm sure, because most Christians don't want to see Peter and Paul in conflict.
Because Acts mends them. But yeah, this is...
I mean, there's a lot that you have to sort of smooth out the story,
I think Paul does in Corinthians 2 call them super apostles. Like
yes,
he's
he does.
mocking them.
Oh yeah, those super apostles. I'm not like them, but I'm really better than they are because they haven't had the ascent to heaven that I was given.
Wow.
And they haven't had the revelations that I've had.
Do you think that when he said I met a man once, he's talking about the moment that he received these revelations?
Yes.
Okay. Absolutely.
And he say, look, I've had revelations. He says it in 1 Corinthians 2. We have secret wisdom tradition. We know divine wisdom. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but yes, I do know what it is, and the Spirit taught it to me personally. And if you're not taught by the Spirit, you don't have it. I mean, Paul is pretty certain about his message being the only one you should really listen to.
Powerful. And that's the one that really takes over the backdrop of the Gospels in Mark. I really think Mark is utilizing a Pauline tradition. What do you think?
Yes, very likely, but so are the people who write these other Gospels. They think of Paul as the great apostle, and they say what we care about with Paul is not just what he's written in his letters, but his secret mysteries. So there's an apocalypse of Paul among the secret Gospels that talks about Paul's trip into heaven. There are other claims that Paul had secret mysteries, and we can tell you what they are. Those people can't tell you because they don't know. They just read what's written in the letters. We know the secret mysteries he taught. And the fathers of the church said, no, he didn't teach secret mysteries. He said himself that he did, but we know he didn't. And Jesus didn't either. Of course, they're ignoring Mark 4:11 and 12, where Jesus says he's going to teach them privately. But the Orthodox line is that he never did that.
So let's mention the Gnostics and how Christians vilify one another before we exit.
Well, the Gnostics didn't call themselves that. They called themselves Christians. So yes, there were Christians who called them heretics. And so they said, heresy was inspired by Satan, by the demons. So you're just teaching stuff that devils have taught you, that Satan taught you. You're as bad as those other people, or you're worse. So yes, they use that. And then, Catholics and Protestants, right, in the history of Europe, were killing each other in the religious wars. They were burning at the stake, Catholics burning Protestants at the stake for translating the Bible into English, Protestants burning Catholics at the stake. I mean, it was a life and death battle, because those people are evil and we are God's people. Both sides saying the same thing.
So technically everybody's Satan and everybody's on the right side from their own perspective.
It works that way. See, if you just say good and evil, then don't you think you're the good one?
I like to think so.
Well, so does everybody else.
Right.
And I've been called, in certain circles, which you will understand, Elaine Pagan.
Oh, wow.
And people I didn't know this, but on some websites, that's what they call me. They say she's not really a Christian. And another professor in Atlanta at a theological seminary told students at Princeton, when we were talking, that I was trying to destroy the church because I'm teaching things that are contrary to church teaching.
What, if you could comment on that, what would you say to that person? Like, you're trying to factually present that there are more than one representatives, like you did on the show. I got to pull it up again. Here we are, right? On this, in this conversation. Oh, am I in the right one? Maybe I went to the wrong one. No.
If you have to go into the one with Stephen Colbert.
Did I exit it? I might have exited. Nope. Here it is. Okay, there it is. So in this particular interview you did with Stephen,
that's with Stephen. Yeah, that was funny.
That was hilarious. But you also mentioned, look, ultimately this tells us there were various forms of Christianity, and yours is just the authoritarian one, the one that won out in history.
Right.
And I ask everybody to go check your website out for sure. But
it's funny.
How do we know what came first? Like, how do we know which version of Christianity actually is the most original? Or, you know what I mean?
It's a hard question. I mean, Bart Ehrman will tell you that it's proto-orthodoxy, but he's just claiming that the Orthodox horse won the race. So the ones that support that point of view are the racehorse to check, right? There were Christian groups all over the known world, from Africa to Egypt to what is now Britain and France and Spain and Iran and Africa. And they developed different ways of understanding the gospel. Wow. Because some of them had only one gospel to read. Some of them only read Matthew. Some of them only read Mark. Some of them, who knows? Some of them probably didn't read, and they heard preachers preach. Somebody probably like Paul.
Some of these other letters, too, that you've been reading, that you have in the Gnostic letters.
And so there were many different versions of the Christian truth. That's why you have to claim that there's a straight thinking way to approach this. And we have it. Right?
We all have it. Everybody's right and everybody's wrong. Well, I ask everyone right now, please go down in the description. I'm telling you, if you're like wanting the book, it's not expensive. Go on Amazon, get her book. Also on Audible, the person that reads it does a fantastic job on the origin of Satan. Get all her works, because stay tuned. We're going to be interviewing her more. In fact, I'm hoping to put together an in-person trip. I'll set up a GoFundMe or something to make that trip possible, and to go and meet with Professor Pagels in person about her book.